Creoso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, Freeform edition. And today I just wanted to take some time to chat about why I can be a bit of an idiot. This one's going to be a little different. We're going to wander around a little bit. I wanted to give you there was a thought piece that I had in one of the discussions I was doing a couple weeks back that I cut out of the podcast because I wasn't sure it sounded like something I wanted to bring up at that particular point in time. And I do want to delve into it a little bit here, as this seems like a more framed place for this kind of thing. But let's start with the first part of this discussion. Let's start with the idea that I can be a bit of an idiot. So why do I say that? What is it about this particular episode that kind of keys into that? And it's not anything particular. It's just sort of an overall thought process I've had. Because in part triggered by listening to another podcast a few months back where they were talking about when they were young and sort of the dumb things that they did when they were young. So I was thinking about it, and they were talking more like teenage years and maybe early 20s. And I was thinking about it more from the perspective of what are things I've done that you wouldn't necessarily suggest people to do that aren't like illegal or anything silly like that, but more the fact that maybe I should have thought ahead a bit before I made that decision, or thought clearer on things before I made that choice, and maybe what those decisions meant in the long run. And sometimes they turned out fine, sometimes maybe they didn't, and kind of how those things kind of go. And so I think the first one and the most obvious one is, why did I decide to start this podcast, and why have I struggled at times with it, and what do I view as being something that I decided to do when I began that maybe I should have thought through before I started the podcast? I think the biggest thing that, if I was to look back and say in retrospect, here's what I would like to do better, and I've talked about this a bit in the past, is that I think the earlier episodes are weaker because the research isn't as good, in my opinion. And that's the reason why we're starting off with the Ancient Wales podcast episodes. And I want to move that. Eventually it'll end up being called Roman Britain, and it will do with that. And then we might move on and redo some of the early post-Roman period stuff as well. But we'll see, because the one thing that I can say, I started the podcast in part because I thought there was a weakness in Welsh history, and specifically in some of the coverage of Welsh history that I saw at the time. What I didn't know at the time is part of the reason for that was the lack of sourcing. And had I realized that, I might not have been so quick to jump on the bandwagon, which I guess it's a good thing that I did, because it helped get a message out about Wales in my own little corner. It definitely has educated me, but that's something where you have to make those decisions kind of with a little forethought. And initially it was more like, oh, there's this niche in the marketplace that I want for myself. I want to be able to listen to a Welsh history podcast. There isn't any out there. What do I do? And it was encouragement by others that made me go, okay, well, I'll start one. And before that, I'd only really run one podcast, which didn't really work out. And before that, I was a member on a couple of others, semi-successful ones. So for me, it was kind of coming to grips with the fact that I needed to understand better what I was doing. And a lot of where I began is not where I've ended up now. So that is one thing I will say. And the other thing I would like to have done beforehand is get better at Welsh, of words in Welsh specifically, and not always be fumbling to try and remember them and then say them 3 different ways in one podcast, because I'm fumbling between different versions of it, and my mouth goes, oh, this is the way we used to pronounce it, and my brain is going, but that's not the way we're supposed to. And so we just mess up constantly. So those are like, that's some nitpicky stuff. I get that. I'm not criticizing myself for starting a podcast, for heaven's sakes. But I will say that in retrospect, there would be some things I would change going forward. I think the other thing that things that seem rational at the time that kind of you wonder about later was when we moved to Wales in 1999. I did that. How do I say this? I did this on a whim. I think if I'm honest with myself, I did it on a whim. At the time, it worked out in the long run, but it was done on a whim. It was done on the fact that, well, I'm at this point in my life. I'm not happy with what's going on in my life. I want to make a change. So here's a really drastic change that's going to totally upend my life and my family. And I can do it right now, so why not? And that was very iffy. It could have been very dangerous. I had some real struggles for a bit when I got there, dealing with being separated from my family and they from me as well. And then I think the other thing that really hit me was how difficult it was to adapt to a completely different location that I had zero experience with. And thankfully, met a lot of good people. Some of my best friends still live in Cardiff today or in the area. And I still talk to a lot of them even now, and for various reasons. So for me, I got lucky, I guess. For other people, it doesn't always work out like that. But massive change like that can be so risky. And in retrospect, if I was thinking a little bit about it, maybe I would have planned a bit better, and maybe I would have not rushed into it quite as quickly. Because one of the mistakes I made, and this is where I point out mistakes I've made, this is why, is because I went over August 1st. Now, I think I've mentioned this in the past, but in case you didn't know, August 1st is not the start, but it's pretty close to the summer holiday for the British school system, which generally starts its holidays at the end of July and goes until the end of August. And so for 6 weeks, nobody's in school. So that's when everybody takes their holidays and they do all those kind of things. And suddenly I went over at the worst possible moment to try and find work. And again, in retrospect, I probably wouldn't have done that. But at the time, I had done some preliminary research in a time period when there wasn't a Google and there wasn't really an easy way to do that kind of stuff. So one of the things I had done was I contacted a contract agency over there, but I contracted an agency in London. And in retrospect, that wasn't where I was wanting to live. So I don't know why I did that, but that's what I did. And they were like, oh yeah, there's jobs. Come on over. And there was jobs, and don't get me wrong, I did get work fairly soon. I mean, it was a couple of months. If you minused the 6 weeks of summer that I basically ended up going over for, it was only really a month, because I got my job in October of that year. It was really close to me debating coming back home because it had been 2 months and I was really worried that I wouldn't get work. So I got lucky. I got a job fairly quickly after that, and I was able to bring my family over 2 months later. And so after 4 months of being separated, we were more or less back together in a place that we ended up renting towards the end of December, or letting if you're in Britain. And it all worked out again. So it doesn't mean that things can't work out when you make silly decisions, but you can make silly decisions and they don't work out. And I would probably counter by saying moving back to Canada when we did was a mistake. And that is one that if I could have something back, that would be the one I would like back. Because moving back in 2003, so 4 years into my time in Britain, I got panicky because my visa was coming to an end and I didn't know if I could get it renewed, and I was getting mixed messages about that. And so I was like, well, I guess we should probably go, and got very rushed into leaving. And I think had we stayed there for another year and a half, we would have been able to A, sort out all the immigration stuff, B, and most importantly to me, get us to the point where we'd be able to apply for citizenship, which is something that I really wish we'd have done, because for my kids, especially, not so much for me, but for my children, it would have been important. So that is one thing that I do regret quite a bit in the decision making that I did. Because to me, I got why. I mean, looking back on it now with the decisions I had then, it made sense, but it also was too quick. And I think it created a situation where I got panicked because of messages I was receiving from Canada that, oh, you need to go now, you need to do this, you need to do that. And I started rushing on time periods of people who weren't me, weren't my family, didn't understand what we were doing, only were concerned, let's be honest, about themselves. And I fell for that. And I really wished I never did. And it is very frustrating to me now to look back at that and think, boy, was that a mistake. Now, the counter to that is to say, well, you might not have had a job at that point, or a number of other things could have happened, or maybe you don't get your visa sorted out. And then all of a sudden, what do you do? And there's all those other side effects that you could look at. But to me, what overwhelms it all is the fact that I think it could have happened later if I'd have given it more time and more thought and less stress on, oh no, this feels right, let's do that. And I think in retrospect, I think that's actually the one thing I regret the most about coming back from Britain. I don't completely regret coming back. Certainly my work environment, my educational environment worked out a lot, I wouldn't say better, but a lot different because of that. Because I had been in the tech industry and the technical support aspect of things for a number of years at that point. And I came back and immediately went into totally different environment. I worked at a weekly newspaper. I worked for different people in political and in government, and just it all changed dramatically. Like the current workplace I have now, I don't think I would have ever gotten in Britain at the time if we were to compare, and I don't think the circumstances of my current employment would work the same. But at the same time, I was happy going down the technical path too. So retrospect, good, bad, right? For me though, when I look at that and I was to examine it, I think that even a year or even 2 years would have made a huge difference to my family, to our situation. And I think for my kids who are born in the UK, especially, it's very frustrating that there's no way for them to go back that works for them. And it's almost upsetting in a way, because I think that they should have been given a chance to get their citizenship, and the fact that they couldn't kind of is a bummer. Not kind of, it is a bummer to me. So I'm still kind of annoyed about it. So are they, to be honest with you. They both weren't happy about it and haven't been happy about it. Now, whether they would ever get it on their own, I don't know, but that's kind of where I'm at with that. So that part of it kind of bothers me. And if I was to talk about a mistake, that would be one I would definitely say. Would that have meant I would have stayed in Britain or Wales specifically? I don't know at this point. I couldn't tell you. But what I can say is that I would have for at least 2 more years before making a decision to come back to Canada. And like I said, I'm not sure I regret coming back to Canada, but I do. And I have since then, in fact, tried to go and move back to the UK again in 2011 and spent 6 months in the UK bouncing around friends of mine's houses and basically paying for things, but not paying for rent, which was good for me. But at the same time, it was not great. And it didn't work out because unfortunately I came over right as cuts were being made, and all of my experience was built around government support type things. So not having the ability to do that because they're like, do we hire the 40 million British people that are all lining up for this job, or the one Canadian guy? You know, you weren't probably going to get that job. So I realized it after a while and kind of decided that, you know what, we're just going to go back home because obviously that's not working for me. And eventually that, a few years later, turned into my current employment, which has worked out pretty well for me for a decade. But if there was opportunities to go back, I would be there in a heartbeat, because that's still kind of where my thought process is. Even, now almost 15 years later. And if you want to go back to when I lived there properly, like we're talking 24 years later, I think I would still, or 20 years later, I think I would still go back in a heartbeat under the right circumstances with the right sort of situation. And I don't think I haven't made that clear in this podcast before. So if you were surprised by that, sorry. You don't do a Welsh history podcast if you don't love the country you're talking about. And, for all of its, much like Canada, all the good and bad, I still love it. And I would live there in a heartbeat. Now, that's one aspect of what I wanted to talk about. I think the other thing is that when you're young and you're making decisions, sometimes you make them because you think, okay, I know what I'm doing. I can do this. I don't have to listen to people, blah, 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 blah. And sometimes you get talked into stuff by others. I had friends that have talked me into things that I regretted shortly after doing them. I've had in-laws who talked me into a vehicle, which broke shortly thereafter, which I still am not happy about to this day. Although it was a long, long time ago. And they talked me into a house and rushed me back from Britain. That's another story. Which turned out to be a real money pit and a disaster. So that was fun. And then what else? I think the other thing is you make a decision based on what you think is the right thing to do. But sometimes it's like, hey, maybe forethought might have been good. I got lucky in one instance, though. I will say my dad and I didn't talk loads growing up once I got into adulthood, especially. And a lot of times we were at loggerheads. But I will say, and if anybody asked me, I would always say that he had been one of those people that he would give me advice where if I asked for advice on specific types of things like economic things or moving things or job related things, sometimes I would listen to at least what he said because I think he had a pretty good understanding of that. I think one of the biggest things he taught me that I took away from him was I had gone out to a place to work for someone who it turned out was really not in my personality matchup, if I want to put it that way. We did not get along. His expectations for what he wanted were way different from what I had been told. And the expectations were way higher than I thought they would be for someone who I had thought I knew pretty well. And so, I've gone out there sort of taking it on a wing and a prayer with no idea whether it was going to work out. And, I just asked my father, I said, what should I do? And he just said, look, what I would say is call it a good vacation and go home. And this is when we were living in Britain. And so I'd come back to a place in the United States to work for someone and it didn't work out. And this is what he said. And I was just like, yeah, that sounds about right. And I went home and I never have ever regretted that. It was amazing. And I will say that his advice on that front was really, really good because it really was great to just say, hey, I got to live in a place that I would have never have gone to otherwise for about 3 weeks. Good fun. Enjoyed myself while I was there. Didn't really feel like what the reason I had gone down there was a good move for me. And I'm happy to come back to my employment and everything. And as it turned out, I had taken a holiday from work. So it wasn't like or vacation days, if you want to use North American terms. And so I was still in my current employment, but I was trying this out to see what it was like. Long story short, it was one of those times where I took the advice and it was excellent. And I will always say, no matter what, without that advice, I might have got into something that I thought was a good idea and really, really entered into a really bad situation because I just didn't understand well enough. And I think that was something that he was able to teach me. And that is, you don't always have to do something just because you feel like you're obligated to, and you can walk away from it rather than get stuck into something where you're miserable. And I definitely in that situation would have been miserable. So yeah, no, it is still something I even look back on today and think of and go, he's absolutely right. I think the other thing that comes to mind from a story standpoint on this front is I think my biggest regret is not playing more sports as a child. I'm very big into sports. I don't know if you've noticed with the amount of jerseys I wear on the video format of this podcast, and support a number of teams and different sports across the world. I only really played football or soccer, depending on where you're from, as a kid, and I wished I'd have played more. I really would have loved to have got into some other sports, some of which I wasn't allowed to get into for various reasons, and other ones that I wished I had been able to do, but I wasn't very good at it. So that didn't help. I couldn't play basketball to save my life. I'm very short, and I'm not very skilled at it. So glasses being a real big problem when it comes to trying to throw a basketball, at least for me anyway. And I have very poor eyesight. The joy of being big into reading as a small child, and bad eyesight. So, which I blame my grandmother on. I don't know. And because she had Coke bottle glasses most of her life too. So I swear she passed them on to me. And which again, kids, that's not a great thing to do, is reading in the dark at night. Straining your eyes, not a good thing. But yeah, I wished I had done more. It was a lot of fun. What I did do, I wish when my kids wanted to do it, I was able to do it more with them. That would have been a lot more fun. Unfortunately, the one time I got most of them into sports, I ended up going to Britain for 6 months and completely missed it all. So, and I would have loved to have been able to go out and support them and watch them do that kind of stuff. Yeah, I just didn't get to. It was just one of those things where I had signed them up before I had made the decision to go to the UK. So it was unfortunate, but there you are. And so I think those are the kind of things, those are regrets, little things like that. They're not really dumb things. They're just things that I think about and go, this would have been good. Maybe it's more of a regrets podcast. I think the other thing is if I was to look at things I've done that's silly, I'm klutzy. I am terrible with dropping stuff and with throwing stuff accidentally and falling down and tripping over. I remember very famously going back into the house when I was living in California and tripping and falling right on my face in front of people, and then standing up and going, ta-da! I was so embarrassed, but didn't want to admit that I had just made an absolute fool out of myself. So I tried to act it, fob it off as if it was just accident. It wasn't accidental. I did this on purpose. Or, those kind of things where you do stuff and you're trying to act like it didn't actually go completely disastrous. And thankfully, I've never broken too much. I think I've broken my hand once, based on a guess, but a pretty educated guess based on what happened to my hand when I did it. Playing touch football and getting squashed. Got my hand trapped between me and the guy that I was trying to tackle, and the guy behind me trying to stop me. And it didn't work out well for my hand, which ended up quite inflated. And it was sore for a very long time afterwards. But I don't think I did a massive amount of damage, but it might have just sprained it or twisted it or something. But it felt like it was broken for a long time because it was very bad for a while. Yeah, so those are the big ones. Sometimes you make mistakes when you're young in making decisions that, in retrospect, it didn't make any sense. Moving to locations with no thought process, definitely not something I would suggest. Thankfully, the Welsh one wasn't really bad. It turned out really, really great. But I've moved to other places which were an utter fiasco, and just because I really didn't know any better at the time. And thankfully, those only haunted me, not anyone else. So, but when you're like 18, 19 and you're making decisions on your own and you're just running from place to place to place to place with no real set address, that can be a problem. To kind of move away from that a little bit, let's move on to more of a discussion about the future I'm considering with this podcast. over the next little while, and this is one of the things I was going to talk about previously, but I wanted to kind of set it up as more of a individual discussion that I wanted to have with you guys, obviously. One thing I'm going to try and do this year, 2025, is going to be about trying to get more people onto the podcast, do more interviews, talk to more people from across the world who come from both history, archaeology, or just come from interest levels in different subjects who I find them intriguing or fascinating, who might have viewpoints that I may or may not always agree with, who may stand in different fields and different understandings of things, who might talk about different subjects that don't necessarily have to do with history. That's kind of one of the things I've been thinking about, especially with this particular podcast, because Freeform has always been sort of an open discussion, and I want to keep it that way. And the reason for that is because I think having 4 to 5 history episodes a month is really taxing, and I don't think I can keep up and live up to the standard I would be happy with, let alone what you might be happy with. So I want to keep away from getting swamped and doing too much of that. And I think with 4 to 5 podcasts a month, I think that's a good way to kind of protect that. So one of the things I want to do is, rather than just it being about me talking to you, I want to bring other voices in to sort of help out with that, to kind of bring in other viewpoints. One thing I'm trying to arrange and haven't got there yet is I want to be able to bring in people from, say, speaking of sports, but people who understand the sporting communities in Wales and have things they want to say. People who come from backgrounds and maybe even, so I'm gonna caveat this by saying it ain't about politics, but I might want to bring in somebody who has a political experience. How about that? Political experience in Wales, who wants to talk about aspects of that. Not necessarily political people, but there might be. I haven't really thought this through, but I want to talk about that. I've always said that I don't want the podcast to be a political podcast. I try and stay away from that. I don't want to get into the debates about the Conservatives, the Labour, Lib Dems, and Plaid, and all of that kind of stuff, or the Reform, take your pick party. I don't really want to get into that because I don't think that serves the purpose of this podcast, which is to kind of be a bit non-denominational on that subject. But if I can find people that I trust that will talk about aspects of it without necessarily getting hung up on, I'm right, they're wrong, this guy's wrong, that woman's wrong, this person's wrong, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to get into that. This is not social media. This is a podcast where we don't really delve into that kind of stuff. There's loads of other podcasts where you can delve into that if you have a particular interest. If you're a big Labour supporter or a Plaid Cymru supporter or a Conservative supporter or what have you, there is a place for you out there. I'm sure you can look it up and you can find it. I can tell you, for me, I actually listened to the BBC's Welsh political podcast, and I find it fascinating, and it's quite educational. But that's me, and not everybody's interested in that. And I don't necessarily assume that people that are interested in Welsh history necessarily care about Welsh politics, or at least current Welsh politics. So I don't necessarily want to do that. But I might bring somebody on who maybe does, and talk to them about their experience and what they think on certain things, without getting into, like I said, the negatives, my side's always right, your side's always wrong sort of stuff. That's not what we're here to do. But that's only one idea. The other one I've thought about is bringing in people from other stories. Like, one of the ones I've reached out to is someone who does content creation on a completely different subject matter, and interviewing them on that, because I think they're really interesting people. And I think they have a lot of cool things to discuss, which aren't necessarily, well, and to be blunt, are very Welsh non-adjacent. But I think that they would be interesting. That's what Freeform is. It's about being free. in the subject matter free and what the discussion is, and giving you guys an opportunity to kind of experience other things than just here's this, and be a one boilerplate sort of thing. However, I will say this. If that isn't working for you and you don't want certain things, or you do want certain things, please, please, please tell me. It's good to know. It's good to know. Is this working? Is this not working? Why are you doing that? Why don't you do more of this? Give me those kind of things. You can put them in on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Welsh History Podcast, or at Welsh History Pod. We'll give you access to that. I think it's Welsh History Pod. It might be Welsh History Podcast. Or just search Welsh History Podcast on YouTube. I'm sure you'll find it. And just comment on this episode and let me know what you would like, because that is important. And if you listen to this podcast, you obviously don't have to watch that one, but just leave a comment and I will take that forward. Or choose one of my social medias and or Gmail account. Let me know, because honestly, I'm sure there are things I haven't really thought about, and I appreciate your support and your input. And let's talk about one other thing. When people send me comments and you as a content creator receive them, I've known enough content creators in my life to know that negative comments can be quite harmful to them. They'll over-focus on them. They'll be very much you can get 100 compliments and the one criticism becomes the, oh my God, what am I going to do kind of thing. And I want to say that I would love to say it doesn't bother me, but it does. When people are like, hey, you do this wrong or that wrong, or why don't you do more of this? Why do you do so much of that? And blah, 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 blah. And that's fine. Sometimes it's not criticism. Sometimes it's just, I'm not interested in this subject matter, which I'm perfectly fine with people not being interested in that. And I don't try and delve too much into one subject matter all the time. Part of the reason why I sort of diversify as much as I do is to help give people other things to listen to. If they don't really like one thing, at least they got another thing to listen to. You've got going on 250 episodes of various types of this podcast, and you can kind of pick and choose what you want to listen to if you want, and go from there. If you just want to blitz through it all, I'm happy to let you do that too. Now, in saying that, there are people who've said, oh, you're this, you're that, da-da. I will say, if there's anything I can tell you, it's that it bothers me more than it bothers you. When I mispronounce things, it bothers me a lot. When I listen to my own voice, because I have to for editing's sake, it drives me insane. There's nothing worse for me than listening to me. But it has to be done, so we listen through, because you got to catch mistakes, you got to edit, the problems and the stoppages and the gaps in this discussion, or rambly topics that I sometimes get into, and peel them back a bit. So I do notice these things. I don't pick up on all of them, and I do try. I've actually gone back and re-recorded pronouncing names of things because I've pronounced it so poorly or so inconsistently in some episodes. And I don't know if you noticed, but it is something I will occasionally do. Finally, I just want to talk about one more thing, and then we'll call it a day for this episode. But I just wanted to kind of cover some of this stuff I've done in the past that I kind of regret, that I wished I had done differently. I've had real thoughts, like I said, at times of going back, and I would probably, under the right set of circumstances, go back again. But let's not get into that. Let's talk about something positive, shall we? I have been thinking long and hard on a couple of different things. One is Patreon. I ask you guys to help me out on Patreon if you can. It's never, ever been a demand or a part of why people listen to this episode or this podcast. I don't want anybody to feel obligated to help out with that. But for everybody who does, I tremendously appreciate it. And you don't know how often it's come in and helped me get the research I need done. However, I'm aware that if you are a patron, you notice that there is not a lot there for you. I do have some things, but not much. I want to change that going forward. And so I've had thoughts about ways to do that. I've thought about incentives. I've thought about different ideas, but the biggest problem I run into, and so to kind of explain, the best way to do this would be to have content where I publish it early and give it to Patreon first and then give it to you. This is something most content creators do, or do a version of it that's different. Now, I've thought about doing all sorts of different things, and there's certainly things I could do. Like I did an episode for the podcast specifically going through my books and actually showing each of my books and what they are and what they're talking about, which I then turned into an audio podcast, which is here. But I actually have a video one where I actually show the books off. There's been a couple of other things like that. And in fact, Freeform was derivative from that a bit. However, I stopped doing it because I was doing so many other episodes that it started to kind of overwhelm me to do that. So I kind of pulled back from that. So what I've been thinking, and I'm going to start moving towards this, hopefully with the idea in 2026. Okay. So far in the future, I understand and accept that that's a bit away. But yeah, I feel like if I set that deadline, it'll make it a lot easier for me to meet that goal. I want to add value to Patreon. So over the next few months, I'm going to be considering some of the options and some of the tiers, some of the ways to make it better. I've removed, I think, most of the higher set tiers because I was not happy with having them there. And the reward aspect was pretty minimal. So what I'm going to try and do is hopefully use Patreon for everybody who does donate to eventually be able to do video episodes where we go to places in Wales, go to locations, talk about the history of them. Maybe even as a first step this year, we'll use some of the photos I've taken at various places and talk about those places specifically. But that would be a very home movie-esque kind of thing, which I'm not sure I love. I do have a video I took years ago at St. Fagans at the Welsh. I can never remember what this museum is called. It's the outdoor museum anyway, where you can go see all the outdoor things. I know it's changed names several times, but it's in St. Fagans, which is in Cardiff. And so I always get befuddled as to which it is, and I don't want to Google it because that'll take that much longer to look up. But what I would like to do is to bring that video in and talk about the site that we're looking at, kind of the experience I had there, talk about the various things that are parts of that and how it reflects. Because what I did was I went to St. Helios Church, which is there, and took a video walking up, walking in, and all the experience inside, plus all the photos I took, which are in better quality, and discuss those kind of things. That's something I do want to do. It calls for a little bit of editing because that video is really poor as far as the audio of it. So I would just probably remove that and just do a voiceover. And then that would be something for people who are actually paying into Patreon. But the other thing I do want to do, and like I said, this will be the 2026 version of this, hopefully, is I'm hoping in the next year to go back to Wales and spend some time, be it on a more permanent basis or a temporary basis. I'm not sure yet. And if so, what I would like to do is start to do actual on-site locations and kind of walk you through some of it, talk about the history there, and kind of go outside of the usual presentation that we do in the podcast where it's like, here's the chronological history of blah, blah, blah. But do like, we're at Caerphilly Castle. This is Caerphilly Castle. This is why it was built this way. Look at this thing. Look at that thing. Da, 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 da. You know, maybe talk to an expert who actually understands the thing. Do more of a documentary style, I guess, is what I want to do. If we can get the financing to do that, that's my goal. And one of the reasons why I've been bringing in sponsors and ads that are outside of the norm is to help do that eventually. And we're not there yet, but hopefully in the next, like I said, by the beginning of 2026, that's where I want to be. So if you contribute to the Patreon, and if you want to be a patron, that's where that money will be going, probably for the rest of this year and into next. That will not be a lot at the moment, but it will be a good starting point. And that's kind of where I want to kick this off is to look at that. One, because I think it makes an incentive for people who are donating, who I think deserve that incentive, so that it makes it valuable for you as a donator. Two, I think it would kick me into doing stuff that I really wanted to do, which is go around to these sites and talk about them and go more in depth. I mean, imagine actually going to an Iron Age hill fort and saying, hey, here's an Iron Age hill fort. Here's what it looks like. Here's what it looks like today. Here's things that they found. Go into Caerleon and talk about the Legionary Fort and some of those kind of things, rather than just talking about it verbally, but actually show it off and go to places that people don't know so much about. Not the big famous ones, but some of the little ones that people maybe don't always go to. That's where, and not to throw a name out, but I'm going to do it. That's where people like Wales Outdoors are useful, because they do take you to places like that. And I think that's a great way to discover history that you might not even know about, which you might actually be quite fascinated by. Believe me, I've walked into museums and strange little things. One of the towns I lived in had a carriage museum, completely massive, big old government funded carriage museum from like all these carriages from the end of the 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s, before the invention of the car, or before the car took hold as the main form of transportation. It's really cool. We also randomly have an airplane museum south of us here in where I live, which is massive just for no reason at all. It's in a little small town, which I'm not even sure has an airport, but it has this massive museum and there's lots of interesting things there. That's not very Wales and not very Welsh and not even British as such, but just as examples, right? So that's kind of one of the things I've been thinking about. And also going to places like, some of the churches and some of the areas in and around I can think of in North Wales that are amazing and great places to visit, but also have very important historical significance. And all of those things for me are kind of important, and they're kind of things that I've thought a lot about. And I've been encouraged in the past by a couple of people who listen to the podcast to kind of look at that as an idea. And I've always said, well, I would love to do that. I just don't have the money to do that. And so that's one of the things that I think if I set this goal for myself and I ask for your support to do that, I think it'll make me feel obligated to actually do it. Whereas if I don't feel obligated to do it, I'm going to put it off because it's easier to put off than to actually do what I should be doing, which I think is making this podcast even better. And I think eventually you would take all those documentary videos and stuff, and eventually they would start out on Patreon. Eventually I would probably move them to YouTube as kind of an additional thing that way to encourage people to go to YouTube, because, hey, could always use more subscribers there. And I encourage you to go there. Even if you just listen to the podcast, if you subscribe to YouTube, it would be very helpful for me. It shows YouTube that people are listening and watching and viewing and actually interested in the podcast. So that's helpful. Playing the algorithm game, as they say. I haven't really pushed it much, but as I've been doing these video versions of the podcast, I think it's helpful. And I got lots of good feedback there as well. So I would like to make it valuable to them. And hey, if more advertising comes in, if financing comes in various other methods than just what we're talking about with Patreon, then it would even make it easier to do all this, which is what at the end of the day, as I said, what I want to do is offer you as complete a podcast as possible. I want to get more Welsh voices involved who actually have backgrounds in fields that make sense. Some maybe not in things that make sense, just talking about weird and wonderful things. And if you are a Welsh person who happens to listen to this podcast and you're like, hey, I might be one of those, please contact me. I would love to talk to you. Might have to set things up on the weekend because there is a 7-hour time difference between me and thee. But it would be great to talk to you, and I would love to do so. And I would encourage you to consider sending me feedback, because I appreciate any of it. And I definitely appreciate you because without you, I could not do this and it would just be a pipe dream. So thank you very much. Every single penny that's sent to me, I cherish because I recognize that it's coming from your pocketbook at a time when for a lot of people, this has not been an easy period financially. So this is why I'm always hesitant to bring up Patreon, because I don't want people to feel obligated to do that, nor should you, but it does help. So I would say, if you would like that documentary, if you would like more of that kind of content, that's one way that you can encourage me to do it. And I will try very hard to get to do it. So anyway, that's it for this week. I thank you all for listening. I hope this was of value. I hope it was interesting. Once again, thank you all. You are tremendous. Without you, I can't do anything. Thanks a lot. And with all that said and done, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can always reach out to me on any one of X, Blue Sky, or Instagram at Welsh History Pod. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, and if you just want to talk, you can reach out to me at welshhistorypodcast at gmail.com. And if I'm paying attention, I get back to you fairly quickly. As Robert will know, that doesn't always happen. But I do try. Anyway, till next time, everybody, take care. Have a great day. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcasts is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.